This is the disturbing Black Death iceberg. Tier 1. The Siege of Caffa. In the mid-1340s, the Mongols, under the leadership of a man named Jani Beg, set their sights on Caffa, a city on the Crimean Peninsula. They tried once in 1343 and failed, but they didn't let that stop them. By 1345, they were back for round 2. Caffa was a Genoese trading post, packed with rich merchants, spices, silk, gold, and just about anything valuable. It was basically the Silk Road's wallet. Jani Beg and his men took one look at all that wealth and figured they'd take the whole thing for themselves. So they surrounded the city and started a siege. The Genoese were ready for it though. They had thick walls, trained defenders, and just enough arrogance to hold out for months. The Mongols tried everything they could think of. They fired siege weapons, cut off supplies, and starved the city from every side. Yet Caffa refused to fall. Then something strange started happening in the Mongol camp. Soldiers started dropping like flies, not from arrows or hunger, but from something invisible. It spread through the tents faster than any siege plan. Men developed strange swellings, high fevers, and then dropped dead. The Mongols didn't know it yet, but their army had been hit by a disease that came from fleas riding on rats. That disease would soon be called the Black Death. Most generals would take a disease killing half their men as a sign to retreat and maybe wash their hands. Jani Beg, though, decided to turn corpses into catapult ammo. The Mongols started flinging their dead soldiers over the city walls, hoping to infect everyone inside. It sounds insane, but it was surprisingly effective. Inside Caffa, people started dying just as fast. It didn't take long for the Genoese to realize the place was finished. So they ran. They got on ships, desperate to get away from the sickness, not realizing the plague had already packed its bags and decided to come along for the ride. The rats were hiding in the cargo and the fleas were on the rats. So by the time those ships reached ports across the Mediterranean, the Black Death had officially hit the road. Historians still argue about whether Jani Beg really catapulted plague-ridden bodies or if it's just a story that grew over time. But either way, that siege marked the moment the world's worst pandemic found its sea legs, the death ships of Messina. In October 1347, 12 Genoese ships pulled into the Sicilian port of Messina, and what should have been a regular trading day turned into a full-blown nightmare. Dock workers hurried to meet the ships, expecting the usual: silk, spices, maybe gold, but instead they found corpses. Most of the sailors were already dead, and the ones still alive looked halfway there. Their bodies were covered in black, oozing boils, and the smell alone was enough to make anyone sick. There was another problem too. The ships were full of rats, and those rats carried fleas that held something very deadly inside them. That something, as you may have guessed, was the plague. The ships would later be called the Death Ships of Messina, which for once is not an exaggeration, since they literally did bring death with them. At first, nobody understood what was happening. Within days, people in Messina started coughing, swelling, and dying just like the sailors. To be fair, the city officials tried to do something about it. They kicked the Genoese out and told their ships to leave the harbor, hoping it would stop the spread. But it was already too late. The disease was already inside the city, and all it needed was a ship. Soon it was hitching rides to Genoa, Marseille, and any port with an open dock. Inside Messina, everything fell apart. The sick were begging for doctors, priests, or just anyone who could help them write a will. But 20 of the city's 24 doctors were already dead, and priests and guards weren't far behind. Out of fear of being infected, people stopped going near each other. Homes were abandoned, which meant thieves could do pretty much whatever they liked, and eventually the city emptied into chaos. Other towns in Sicily looked at Messina and decided they must have done something to make God angry. That made it easier for them to ignore what was happening. Some survivors ran to the nearby city of Catania and begged them to bring the statue of Saint Agatha to Messina, hoping she'd talk God out of killing everyone. Catania said no and locked their gates. So the survivors scattered in every direction, carrying the disease with them to nearby towns, into Tuscany, Florence, and eventually across much of Europe. The Black Buboes. During the Black Death, nothing terrified people more than the black swollen lumps that suddenly showed up on the body. They called them buboes, and once you had one, your days were numbered. They usually appear in the armpits, neck, or groin, and seeing them was like watching your own death notice from under your skin. At the time, people thought they were punishments from God or curses from witches. In reality, it was just bacteria doing its thing. When Yersinia pestis entered the body through a flea bite, it didn't waste time. Within a few days, it attacked the lymph nodes, causing sharp, throbbing pain, fever, vomiting, and weakness. Those lumps could swell to the size of an egg, or bigger, and they kept growing until they either burst or turned black. That black color came from necrosis, which basically means the tissue underneath had started dying. Some sources even say that's where the name the Black Death comes from. Buboes didn't smell much better than they looked. Some people tried to cut them open to drain the sickness, but all that did was spread more infection and make the dying process uglier. Once they started to appear, families abandoned their loved ones because they knew it was game over. As time passed, the buboes became a symbol of how powerless people were. One day you were fine. The next, you had a lump the size of a fist and a priest outside your door. The worst part was that everyone knew there was no cure. You could pray, you could run, you could burn herbs and sniff flowers, but once the black showed up, your story was pretty much over. Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis is the microscopic troublemaker behind the Black Death. It's a gram-negative bacterium that normally lives in rodents and their fleas, then jumps to humans when the opportunity shows up. Fleas would feed on infected rats, then bite humans when their original hosts were gone, dead, or just out of reach. That transmission chain wasn't fully understood until the late 1800s, when a French physician named Paul-Louis Simond figured out the rat-to-flea human connection. Humans could also catch it through contact with infected animals or, in rare cases, through inhaling droplets from someone already sick, which could lead to a pneumonic plague. In 1894, Swiss-French bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin isolated the bacterium during an outbreak in Hong Kong. That discovery changed everything. For the first time, people realized the plague wasn't caused by bad air or divine punishment like they originally thought. It was just a bacterium that had been hiding in plain sight for centuries. With science finally on the case, researchers could trace how it spread, how it evolved, and why it kept coming back. Modern genetic studies later confirmed that Yersin had been right all along. Tests on ancient DNA confirmed that Y. pestis was the same bacteria behind the medieval plague. Scientists even traced its roots back to the Bronze Age, which means it had been lurking around for thousands of years before the Black Death ever showed up. There's also evidence that it caused the plague of Justinian in the 6th century. So it's safe to say this little germ had been bothering humanity for a very long time. Today, Y. pestis is still hanging around, mostly in wild rodent populations across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. In 2025, scientists identified a gene that shows how the bacterium learned to adapt, carefully tweaking the balance between being deadly and being contagious. That tiny adjustment helps explain how it could wipe out entire cities in one outbreak and then quietly linger for years until the next one. Long story short, the Black Death might be long gone, but the bacteria that caused it is still out there. Tier 2. Agnolo di Tura. It's the 1300s. You're living in Siena with your family, and everything feels normal. Then suddenly, your first child gets sick and dies. Before you can even process it, the second one follows. Then the third. You start to think it might finally be over. But it's not. A few days later, your fourth and fifth child are showing the same symptoms. This was the reality for Agnolo di Tura, a man living in Siena, Italy. He was a shoemaker and a tax collector, married to a woman named Nicoluccia, who came from a higher social class than he did. Together, they had 5 children, and when the Black Death reached Siena in May 1348, it didn't take long to tear through all of them. Nicoluccia and every one of their 5 children died. Agnolo was the only one left. He later wrote about what he saw, and it wasn't just his own loss. According to him, the disease moved fast. People would swell under their arms and in the groin and collapse mid-conversation. Families broke apart almost immediately. Fathers abandoned their children. Wives stayed away from their husbands, and even brothers avoided each other. People thought the illness could spread through breath or even just by looking at someone, so everyone kept their distance, even from the people they loved. As more people died, the city just stopped working. There weren't enough people willing or able to bury the dead, whether for money or loyalty, so bodies started piling up in the streets. Eventually, they were dragged into ditches and left there. No one spent much time mourning because everyone was too busy wondering if they were next. Agnolo lived long enough to see the plague finally leave Siena, and by then, the city was barely recognizable. He claimed most of its rulers were dead, along with artists like Ambrogio and Pietro Lorenzetti, and that only 8 people were left alive. He may have been exaggerating, but there's no way to know for sure. After everything they'd been through, the survivors did what people tend to do after something like that. They ate, they drank, and they tried to enjoy whatever was left. And somehow, after losing his entire family and living through all of it, Agnolo remarried and kept going. Pope Clement VI and the Burning Fires. By 1348, the plague had reached Avignon, which at the time was basically the Vatican's temporary Airbnb. Pope Clement VI was holed up inside, watching the city fill with the sick and dying while doing everything he could not to become one of them. Avignon wasn't exactly safe. Once someone showed a boil or bump in their armpit or groin, everyone around them took off running. Families split apart overnight. Kids were abandoned, parents were left to rot, and the dead were either tossed into rivers or left on the streets because no one wanted to touch them. As the plague crept closer to his palace, Pope Clement decided to try something that was part superstition, part science experiment. He'd been told that bad air caused the plague, and that fire could purify the air. He put the pieces together and went with what seemed like the obvious solution. He ordered huge bonfires to be built around the papal compound and sat between two roaring flames all day, every day, for months. And somehow, it worked. The heat and smoke drove away the fleas and rats carrying the disease. While the rest of Avignon turned into a graveyard, Clement stayed safe inside his wall of fire and incense. But he didn't just sit there waiting it out. He made sure the poor were fed, sent doctors to treat the sick, bought land for cemeteries, and paid for proper burials when families couldn't. He also stepped in when mobs started blaming Jewish communities for the plague. He called the rumors nonsense and publicly condemned the killings. To calm people down, he organized a special mass to pray for the end of the plague, and granted what was called a general absolution. That meant anyone who died without confessing or receiving last rites would still be forgiven. In other words, even if a priest couldn't reach you in time, your soul was covered. Today, people still argue about what kind of man the Pope was. Some say he only cared about saving his own skin, while others point to everything he did and say he was one of the few leaders who actually tried to help. So yeah, history remembers Pope Clement VI as the guy sitting between two bonfires trying to outsmart the Black Death. But behind the smoke and superstition, he might have been one of the few who actually managed to keep a bit of humanity burning while the rest of the world fell apart. Jewish well-poisoning massacres. You're inside your home, hearing frantic knocks on the door. Outside, a mob is gathering. Someone shouts that the wells have been poisoned, and the blame falls on you, your family, and your kinsmen. That's why the townspeople are here. They want to make you pay. After the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, the continent became a powder keg of superstition and panic, ready to explode at any sign of trouble. People needed someone to blame for what was happening, and unfortunately, Jewish communities became the scapegoat. Rumors started that they were poisoning wells and springs to infect Christians, and before long, those rumors were accepted as facts. The idea wasn't entirely new. Back in 1321, lepers in France were accused of trying to spread their disease through water. Over time, the claims turned into a full-blown conspiracy, with people claiming Muslim rulers and Jews were behind a massive plot to poison the water across Europe. As the rumors traveled, both lepers and Jews faced violence, execution, and isolation from the rest of society. When the rumors reached Basel along the Rhine, things escalated. Locals demanded action, and by January 9, 1349, a mob stormed the city hall. They pressured the councilors until they got permission to attack the Jewish population. The community was rounded up and locked into a wooden building on an island in the Rhine, which the mob set on fire. Around 600 people were killed that day. Basel was just the beginning. Strasbourg had a much larger Jewish population, and since they weren't allowed to own land, many of the city's Jewish residents worked as moneylenders. That already put them in a tricky spot, so when the rumors about poisoned wells spread there, people who already didn't like them were quick to jump on the story and take action. On February 14, 1349, thousands of men, women, and children were rounded up under the pretense of being moved out of the city, only to be packed into a wooden house and burned alive over 6 days. This became known as the Burning of Strasbourg. A few people survived if they agreed to convert to Christianity, and a handful of women were spared for being attractive. The rest were killed or fled. And after the fires went out, locals looted the Jewish properties and divided them among themselves. The whole story is a lesson on how fear and lies can spiral into organized violence. People believe the worst when they are scared, and the results are always ugly. The Massacre of Erfurt. After the fires in Strasbourg and Basel, you'd think people might have calmed down. But no, the panic just moved east. By the spring of 1349, the German city of Erfurt decided to join in on the madness. Jews had lived there peacefully since the 11th century and were a big part of the city's economy. But when the Black Death reached that area, the same rumor followed. The Jews had poisoned the wells. The weird thing was, while everyone else was dropping fast, the Jewish population seemed to get sick a lot slower. And apparently, that was all anyone needed to be sure they were behind the plague. In reality, it probably had more to do with hygiene. Jewish communities tended to keep things cleaner, washed more often, and stored food better, which kept the rats and fleas away. But logic doesn't stand a chance when panic's running the show. Even though Pope Clement VI and later Pope Innocent VI both said the Jews had nothing to do with the disease, no one cared. The local priests weren't helping either. Some of them even joined the mobs. On March 21st, 1349, while the Jewish community was holding their Sabbath prayers, riots broke out. Mobs stormed the Jewish quarter, smashed through windows, and started killing everyone they saw. By the end of the day, around 3,000 people were dead. Some of the Jews decided they weren't going to give the mobs the satisfaction, so they burned their own houses down and died together inside. The ones who managed to escape had to either run for their lives or convert to Christianity. After the massacre, the city took whatever wasn't nailed down. Synagogues were destroyed, houses were emptied, and the community was all but erased. Among the stolen items were the Erfurt manuscripts, 12th century Hebrew texts packed with religious teachings, commentaries, and legal documents from the local Jewish population. The city council kept the manuscripts as trophies for centuries. Then in 1880, they were moved to the Royal Library in Berlin, where they're still held today as part of what's called the Erfurt Collection. The Peasants Revolt. You're standing in a field that should be full of people, but it's not. Half the nearby cottages are empty because many of your neighbors, who are also your coworkers, are dead. You survived the plague, which means you're supposed to feel lucky. Instead, you're being pushed to work twice as hard for the same pay, even though nearly half the country is dead and there's barely anyone left to replace you if something goes wrong. By the summer of 1381, about 30 years after the Black Death tore through England, this was daily life. The population collapse had left fields untended and towns half abandoned, while the economy clung to survival. With so many laborers gone, the surviving peasants became valuable, and they knew it. But the landowners refused to admit that. Instead of raising wages, they clung to the old system and expected everyone to keep working for the same pay as before the plague. To make things worse, the government stepped in years earlier in 1351 and passed the Statute of Laborers. It locked wages at pre-plague levels, even though everything else had changed. It was the government's way of saying, you'll work for what you earned before the plague, and you'll like it. The law already had people angry. But then came the poll tax in 1380. Every adult had to pay the same amount, no matter how broke they were. That was the breaking point. England was filled with frustration, and all it needed was a spark. It came in the village of Brentwood, when a tax official tried to squeeze peasants for money they didn't have. They fought back, and the rebellion spread fast across southern England. The rebels rallied behind a man named Wat Tyler. He was bold, persuasive, and exactly the kind of person people would follow when they'd had enough. Under his leadership, the crowds grew as they marched toward London. When they reached the city on June 13th, things spiraled. They set buildings on fire, destroyed the Savoy Palace, and killed any royal officials they caught. The next day, King Richard II, only 14 years old at the time, met with the rebels and agreed to their demands. But while he was talking peace, the rebels were storming the Tower of London, where they found and killed the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury. 2 days later, Richard met the rebels again, and everything went downhill. A fight broke out. Wat Tyler was killed on the spot, and panic spread. The mayor of London raised a militia, and without Tyler, the rebellion collapsed. The king's army hunted down the survivors and executed them by the hundreds. By November, around 1,500 rebels were dead. Tier 3. The Flagellant Processions. You're standing in a town square when the singing starts. It's slow, flat, and coming closer. Then you see them. A long line of people moving through the streets in silence, all wearing plain robes with their faces mostly hidden. They don't look sick, but they don't look normal either. Someone near you whispers that they've come to save the town, but nothing can prepare you for just how they plan to do it. In addition to killing millions of people, the Black Death also gave rise to some of the strangest religious movements in history. One of the most infamous was the Flagellant Processions. These were groups of men and women who believed the plague was God's way of punishing humanity for its sins, and the only way to fix it was to punish themselves in return. They moved from town to town in long crocodile lines, dressed in plain robes with hoods that covered everything except their eyes. The men led, the women followed, and at the front marched a master with his 2 lieutenants waving purple and gold banners. They didn't talk much. Instead, they chanted prayers and sang hymns in unison as they moved. News of their arrival usually spread ahead of them, so by the time they reached a new town, crowds were already waiting. The flagellants would head straight for the church, where the bells rang to announce them. After a short prayer, they'd move to an open square and begin what they call the procession. They stripped to the waist and formed a circle. At the master's signal, everyone dropped to the ground in poses meant to imitate the crucifixion or to atone for specific sins. Adulterers lay face down, while perjurers lay on their sides, holding up 3 fingers. When everyone was in position, the master began whipping. And when he was done, they all took turns lashing themselves with leather thongs tipped with bits of metal. Once they were too weak to stand, they'd collapse to the ground, rest for a moment, and then start again. They truly believed their suffering would convince God to lift the plague and forgive humanity. At first, the Catholic Church let it slide, probably thinking it couldn't hurt. But as the processions got larger and the rituals more extreme, even the Pope had enough. By October 1349, Pope Clement VI officially banned the practice, marking the end of one of the darkest religious spectacles of the plague years. Plague cures. By the time the plague had torn through Europe, between 30 and 50% of the population was gone. Entire cities lost half their people in months, and in some places, more than 80% of doctors, the very people meant to figure things out and find a cure, died too. The ones who survived didn't have answers, so they weren't much help either. Medicine was still based on ideas that were over 1,000 years old, and nobody understood what was causing the disease or how it spread. So people did what people always do when they're scared and out of options. They tried everything, no matter how strange, and hoped something would work. One of the more practical ideas was vinegar mixed with garlic, herbs, and spices. This concoction, called Four Thieves vinegar, was supposedly used by thieves who robbed plague victims and never got sick. People rubbed it on themselves or used it before handling the dead, hoping it would protect them. Vinegar had been known as a disinfectant for centuries, and the herbs may have kept fleas or other bugs away, so at least there was a little logic behind it. Onions were another favorite. Patients would rub raw, chopped onions on their buboes, thinking it would draw out the infection. They also held onion fumes near their noses to cleanse the air, which they believed carried disease. Then there was Thomas Vickery's chicken cure. You would pluck the feathers from a chicken's rear and tie the live bird to the buboes. The chicken was supposed to draw out the infection. If the chicken died first, you used another one. But if the patient died first, well, that was the end. Some doctors tried snakes. They'd cut one up and place pieces of it on the sores, thinking the snake's flesh would somehow suck out the disease. Bloodletting was also common practice. Doctors drained blood from patients to restore balance, which mostly just left them weaker and closer to death. And then there were the disgusting remedies. One remedy involved applying a mix of feces, ground lily root, and tree sap directly to the buboes, then wrapping it in cloth. Some historians think ideas like this were influenced by something called the doctrine of signatures. The belief that if something in nature looked like a disease or a body part, it could be used to treat it. The whole thing really makes you wonder who looked at a swollen, infected boil and thought, yeah, poop is just what this needs. And more importantly, who heard that and said, you know what? Let's try it. Needless to say, none of these cures really stopped the plague, but they show how far people were willing to go to survive. Fear and desperation made them try anything, from reasonable to ridiculous. The Plague Saints. As the plague kept doing what it did best, people ran out of options. And like humans do when they're terrified, they clung to anything they thought might give them comfort or a chance to survive. One of those things was praying to plague saints. These were holy figures people believed could protect them, heal the sick, or at least beg God to cut them some slack. One of the most famous was Saint Roch. You'll often see him in paintings lifting his robe to show a nasty plague sore on his leg, while a loyal dog sits nearby. According to legend, Roch went around visiting plague victims day and night, blessing them with a sign of the cross, and somehow, people started getting better. Eventually, he caught the plague himself and decided to hole up in the forest so he wouldn't burden anyone. The story says a dog showed up every day with bread until he healed. A few years later, he died in prison. Naturally, his experience with the plague turned him into a symbol of mercy and divine protection, and his image spread across churches all over Europe. Then there's Saint Sebastian. He got tied to a tree and shot with arrows for being a Christian. Somehow, those arrows became a metaphor for the plague itself, which made him a handy saint to pray to when buboes showed up. Saint Rosalia of Palermo also became a big deal in this time. Some sources say that in the 1600s, her bones were paraded through the streets in solemn processions, and miraculously, the plague in the city suddenly ended. People didn't forget that. So when COVID-19 hit in 2020, the citizens of Palermo decided to call her back for another round of protection, just to be safe. Today, plenty of these plague saints are still venerated. People still light candles and say prayers, hoping for a bit of divine backup whenever life gets messy. Plague burials. You're in 14th century London, and your wife has just fallen to the Black Death, but there's no time for mourning. Instead of washing her, wrapping her, or saying proper prayers, you drag her body into the street, throw it onto the curb, and head back home because that's just the way things are done now. Before the plague, burials were slow, careful, and full of ceremony. Families washed and wrapped their loved ones. Priests blessed the bodies, and graveyards were neat and orderly. When the Black Death hit, all that vanished. Death arrived by the thousands every week, and suddenly there weren't enough hands, enough space, or enough time for proper funerals. Cemeteries overflowed fast. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, and most people wouldn't touch the dead if they could help it. Churches dug massive pits outside city walls, sometimes big enough to hold hundreds of bodies at once. Between 1347 and 1351 in East Smithfield, one of London's largest plague ceremonies, officials buried about 200 people a day at the peak. They dropped bodies in layers, covering each one with a thin layer of dirt before the next batch went in. Because families abandoned the sick and dying, the city hired body collectors. These men went from house to house, and sometimes down the streets, grabbing corpses that had been rotting for days. The whole thing was pretty traumatic. Modern archaeologists have dug up several of these mass burial sites, and the skeletons they've found make it painfully clear just how thoroughly the Black Death emptied London. Beyond East Smithfield, pits have been discovered at Vincent Square, Marshall Street, Charterhouse Square, Whitechapel, and Golden Square. Some even turned up during construction work in the 1960s for the Victoria Line. By the end of the 14th century outbreak, London had lost tens of thousands of people in just 2 years. Some estimates say nearly half the city was gone. Tier 4. The Lazzarettos of Venice. When the Black Death hit Venice in 1347, it tore through the population faster than gossip in a small town. After a few brutal waves, the Venetian government decided enough was enough. If they couldn't cure it, they'd contain it. So, in 1423, they built the first isolation hospital called Lazzaretto Vecchio. The name came from a nearby church, Santa Maria di Nazareth, which locals nicknamed Nazaretum. Over time, the name warped into Lazzaretto. Because, well, Venetian seems to have a knack for renaming things. Anyone who showed signs of the plague was shipped off to Lazzaretto Vecchio. It sounds like a death sentence, but it wasn't total neglect. Patients got beds, food, water. They just didn't get treatment. If you lived, congratulations. If you didn't, you were dumped into one of the island's many mass graves, layered neatly with lime and dirt. After a while, the Venetians realized locking up only the sick wasn't cutting it. So in 1468, they built Lazzaretto Nuovo, which was for all intents and purposes the quarantine upgrade. It looked more like a prison and was used for people who might be infected. Whenever ships arrived in Venice, plague doctors boarded them for inspection. If anyone looked sick, they were sent straight to Lazzaretto Vecchio. The rest of the passengers, crew, and even the ship's cargo were taken to Lazzaretto Nuovo to sit out a long isolation period, 40 days to be exact. That's actually where the term quarantine comes from. The Venetians called it quarantena, meaning 40 days. During those 40 days, everything on board got a full scrub down. Cargo was washed, fumigated, soaked in vinegar, or treated with ashes. The Venetian government took the rules seriously, and anyone who tried to cheat the system could lose their trading rights, or worse. The setup was strict, but it worked, and it didn't take long before other European ports started copying the idea. The plague eventually passed, but Lazzaretto Nuovo didn't disappear with it. The island's still there today, quiet and mostly empty. The Quarantine of Ragusa. You're a merchant arriving at Ragusa, exhausted after weeks at sea. Instead of letting you dock, city officials tell you that you'll have to spend a full month on one of 3 rocky, deserted islands. You'll have to survive in the wooden huts there, and if you fall sick, the hut could be burned down. Back in 1348, Ragusa, which you now know as Dubrovnik in Croatia, learned the hard way that the Black Death was not messing around. Thousands of residents died in that first wave, and the city realized that waiting for the plague to hit before doing something was a terrible strategy. Fast forward to 1377, and the leaders of Ragusa decided it was time to get proactive. Ships were arriving all the time from across the Mediterranean, carrying merchants, sailors, goods, and, inevitably, sick people. On July 27, 1377, the Great Council passed a decree that anyone coming from plague-infected areas had to spend a month in quarantine before entering the city. The new arrivals were sent to 3 remote, empty islands with nothing on them except rocks, wind, and the occasional confused seagull. Conditions were harsh, so the city built simple wooden huts. The wood wasn't for comfort, it was for practicality. If someone died or the plague flared up, the huts could be burned quickly, keeping the infection contained. At first, the quarantine period lasted 30 days and was called Trentino. Later, they bumped it up to 40 days and renamed it Quarantino. Scientifically speaking, nobody actually knew if the extra 10 days did anything. They just liked the religious meaning behind it. Medieval Christians loved the number 40. Jesus fasted for 40 days. The flood lasted 40 days and nights. So 40 sounded like a good number for keeping the plague out of your city. Even with all this, Ragusa couldn't lock itself off completely. Being a port city meant they couldn't just stop all ships and trade. Otherwise, the economy would collapse. Ships still came and went. Goods had to move. And humans, being humans, some rules got bent. Still, the quarantine slowed the spread enough that the city didn't turn into a corpse city like so many others. Eventually, Ragusa added a proper plague hospital on an island called Mjet. This Lazzaretto wasn't just holding a pen. It offered food, shelter, and basic care to anyone who needed it, whether locals or new arrivals. The government covered it all, making sure nobody starved while waiting out the plague. It was practical, effective for its time, and gave the city a real fighting chance. Ragusa didn't become plague-proof, but compared to most European cities, they were leagues ahead. The dancing plague. You're walking through the streets of Aachen in 1374 when you notice something strange. A woman is dancing in the middle of the road. There's no music, no celebration, and no reason for it. As you watch, more people step out of their homes and join her. By the end of the day, the street is packed with bodies twitching and spinning, and no one can explain why they won't stop. In June 1374, Aachen, a small city in what's now Western Germany, got front row seats to what some historians say was one of the weirdest side effects of the Black Death. Out of nowhere, hundreds of people spilled into the streets and just started dancing. There was no music, no festival, nothing. They just kept dancing. Historians later gave this bizarre phenomenon a name, or several names really. Some called it the Dancing Plague, others St. John's Dance, and a few went with choreomania. Now, you're probably wondering what this has to do with the Black Death. Did we just lose the plot? Actually, no. Stay with me. At the time, Europe was still dealing with the aftermath of the plague. Millions were dead, economies had been wrecked, and entire communities were living under constant stress. Some historians believe that pressure built up, and in places like Aachen, it came out in ways nobody really understood. One theory is that the dancing was a form of mass hysteria, triggered by years of fear, trauma, famine, and just general medieval life being unbearable. Another theory points to ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, which can cause hallucinations and convulsions. Then there are the more creative explanations. Things like demonic possession, overheated blood, or just plain bad luck. Meanwhile, over in Italy, people blamed spider bites and insisted that the only cure was to dance the poison out. Whatever the cause, the pattern was the same. From Aachen, the dancing spread to towns along the Rhine, like Strasbourg and Metz, and even parts of Belgium and the Netherlands. Wherever the plague went, the symptoms stayed the same. Anyone who caught it simply couldn't stop dancing. They writhed, jerked, twitched, and moved constantly for days. Some screamed, and others cried out in pain, but they just couldn't call it quits. They didn't sleep, they didn't eat, and their feet got all bloody. Eventually, some just collapsed from pure exhaustion. Then it happened again in July 1518. This time in Strasbourg. A woman named Frau Trophia stepped out of her house and started dancing. Within a week, 30 more people were at it, non-stop. Authorities were panicking, but the religious leaders had an idea. They were convinced that if people just danced more, the problem would fix itself. So they brought in musicians and professional dancers. That worked about as well as you'd expect. the dancing frenzy got worse. Around 400 people were caught up in it, and a few died from sheer exhaustion. The plague finally died down in early September, and life for medieval people went back to normal. Or at least, as normal as it ever got back then. The plague doctors. You've been sick for a few days, and your parents keep saying you'll be fine. In fact, you even start to convince yourself you might be getting better. Then you see this guy walking down the street toward your house, and that's when you realize you're probably not going to make it out alive. By the 17th century, the bubonic plague had already wiped out entire cities and turned Europe into one big graveyard. People were desperate for answers, and that desperation gave rise to one of history's strangest professionals, the plague doctors. They were supposed to treat infected people, though treat is a generous word here. Their real job was mostly to show up, look terrifying, and make everyone think something was being done. They wore long black leather coats that were waxed to keep fluids off, gloves, boots, and glass goggles that made them look like oversized insects. The outfit was designed to block what people called bad air, or miasma, which they believed caused the disease. To top it off, they wore a mask shaped like a bird's beak, stuffed with herbs, mint, cloves, camphor, or rags soaked in vinegar. The idea was that the strong scents would purify the air before it reached their lungs. Of course, it didn't work, but the herbs may have helped them tolerate the stench of rotting bodies. Plague doctors also carried wooden canes. They used them to poke patients, check pulses, and keep their distance. Sometimes they even used the canes to peel back clothing without touching the body. You can imagine how comforting that must have been for the patient. The costume itself was invented by French physician Charles Delhomme in 1619. It later became the official uniform for anyone brave or desperate enough to take the job. Whenever someone in that outfit appeared on your street, it meant one thing: death wasn't far. The tragic part is that most plague doctors weren't real doctors at all. Many were volunteers, failed physicians, or students trying to make a name for themselves. As you can imagine, they didn't save many lives. Most of the time, they just counted corpses and recorded how fast the plague was spreading. The outfit gave them authority, but in reality, there was little anyone could do to stop the Black Death. Tier 5. The Great Plague of London. The Great Plague of London started quietly in the spring of 1665 in a poor neighborhood called St. Giles-in-the-Fields. The streets were narrow, the houses were cramped, and the place was filthy. People basically lived on top of each other. So of course, when the plague finally showed up, it spread like wildfire. Once the infection began spreading, panic set in almost immediately. The wealthy didn't stick around to find out what would happen. They packed up and fled to the countryside. King Charles II and his court were among them, and they didn't return until February 1666. With so many people gone, London's population dropped dramatically, leaving empty streets and silent neighborhoods. The poor had no choice but to stay, which meant they were left to deal with the full force of the plague. People tried whatever they could think of to stay alive. One common practice was holding small bouquets of flowers to the nose to ward off the plague. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time, people believed it could purify the air. That habit turned into a tradition, and today judges still get tiny bouquets on ceremonial occasions as a weird historical leftover. Once a house had infected people and the authorities found out, they'd start by marking it with a red cross and the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." Then they'd post guards outside to make sure nobody came or went. In some cases, healthy family members would be locked inside with the sick, while outside, carts carrying the dead rolled through the streets. Drivers would shout, "Bring out your dead," as searchers collected corpses from homes and streets to throw into mass graves. With so many bodies, the streets reeked, and life in the city had almost completely stopped. By the end of 1665, the plague had reached its peak. In September alone, over 7,000 people were dying every week. When the outbreak finally ended in 1666, about 100,000 Londoners had died. Later that year, the Great Fire destroyed large sections of the city. It cleared out overcrowded buildings and killed off rats, which likely helped stop the plague from returning. London survived, but the scale of loss changed the way the city approached disease, housing, and public health from that point forward. The London Pesthouses. During the Great Plague of 1665, London was in chaos, and the city desperately needed somewhere to put the sick. That somewhere ended up being the Pesthouses. They were quarantine shelters built on the edges of the city where plague victims could be kept away from everyone else. People sent there were expected to either get better or die in isolation. Most of the time, there wasn't much in between. Interestingly, pest houses weren't something invented specifically for the Great Plague. Some had been around for decades. One of the earliest known pest houses in London was built back in 1638 at Tothill Fields, Westminster. Others existed in parishes like St. Giles, which had happened to be the epicenter when the 1665 outbreak started. To fill these pest houses, the authorities sent out searchers, also known as searchers of the dead or plague searchers. They were hired by London parishes to examine bodies and record what people had died from. Some accounts say they also went door to door looking for anyone who showed signs of the plague. Once the searchers found someone, that person was taken to a pest house. Families could either go with the sick relative or stay home. If the whole household left, their house would be sealed up and marked with a red cross. Guards were then stationed outside to make sure no one went in or tried to steal anything. Each pest house was made up of 2 buildings, one for people who were already sick, and another for those who might have been exposed but weren't showing symptoms yet. The buildings had tall stone walls and large windows to allow air to circulate. At the time, people believed the plague spread through bad air, called miasma, so proper ventilation was considered important. Even though no one fully understood how the disease worked, the pest houses did help slow things down. Keeping the infected separate from the healthy gave London a small but important advantage: the Eyam Plague Village. Eyam is a small village in Derbyshire, England, and in 1655, the people who lived there pretty much volunteered to die for the greater good. The trouble started when a tailor named Alexander Hadfield got a bundle of cloth from London. What he didn't know was that the package came with fleas carrying the plague. The first to get hit was Hadfield's assistant, George Vickers. He noticed the cloth was damp and laid it out by the fireplace to dry, which turned out to be a spectacularly bad idea. The fleas hiding in the fabric didn't appreciate the heat, so they jumped ship and bit him. A few days later, George was dead. After that, it didn't take long for the disease to spread through the rest of the village. People knew the plague killed fast and spread faster, and many wanted to flee before it reached their homes. But 2 local pastors, Reverend William Mompesson and Thomas Stanley, stepped in and told everyone to stay. They argued that if people ran, they'd just carry the disease to nearby towns. The villagers didn't love the idea, but the men of God told them it was their duty as Christians. And so, in the end, they agreed. To keep the plague contained, they cut themselves off from the outside world. They marked the village border with stones to warn outsiders not to come any closer. Neighbors from nearby towns would drop off food and supplies at those stones, and the villagers left payments soaked in vinegar, thinking it would kill germs. It didn't, but they tried. For the next 14 months, Eyam turned into a horror show. Families buried their dead alone, sometimes in their own backyards. Church services moved outdoors, and even the reverend followed his own quarantine rules. When the plague finally ran its course in November 1666, only about 90 of the original 350 villagers were left standing. Some sources argued that there were closer to 800 villagers with around 260 deaths. But either way, Eyam had basically wiped itself off the map. The disease didn't spread to the nearby towns, but the village paid the price in full. Today, Eyam is known as the Plague Village, and tourists still come from all over the world to see the old boundary stones, the graves scattered across the fields, and the small cottages where the villagers lived out their quarantine. The plague crosses. During the Black Death, people were terrified of getting infected. Everyone was avoiding everyone else, and yet trade still had to happen. People needed food, medicine, and a way to tell which houses were crawling with sickness. And that's how plague crosses came about. At first, folks marked infected homes with rough chalk drawings or smears of paint, mostly to say, don't come near unless you've got a death wish. But over time, those markings turned into real stone structures. These plague crosses were usually placed in open areas or on the edge of towns, where people could drop off food or supplies without touching anyone. The system was simple, kind of like the one the Eyam villagers used. Some people would leave food and goods at the cross, and others would leave money in return. To disinfect the coins, they usually dropped them into bowls or holes carved into the stone and filled with vinegar or water. Once the trade was done, everyone backed away and hoped for the best. It wasn't exactly a foolproof plan, but it was the 14th century version of contactless payment. One of the most famous examples came from Derby in 1665, where a headless plague cross was used for these vinegar-soaked transactions. Over in Germany, similar crosses were built, though many there served as memorials for the dead instead of trading points. As the years went by, the design of plague crosses started to change. The early ones were plain, simple markers made out of fear and necessity. But after a few centuries, when the panic had passed and people had time to decorate things again, the crosses got fancier. Some even had carvings, prayers, and religious symbols. In small villages, the crosses turned into proper shrines. People would come there to pray, to bargain with God, or to ask the saints to keep them alive for one more week. Pilgrims stopped by too, figuring a quick prayer at a stone cross was worth a shot. Some of these crosses still stand today, weathered and forgotten by most people passing by. Back then, though, they were a lifeline, built by people who were just trying to stay alive without starving. Tier 6. The Great Plague of Marseille. Before 1720, Marseille had already seen its fair share of plague waves. Being one of the busiest trading ports in the Mediterranean was great for business, but terrible for keeping diseases in check. Goods, people, and rats moved in and out constantly, giving pathogens a free ride across the city. During the epidemic that lasted from 1649 to 1650, the city had actually built a sanitation system that was strict, mandatory, and surprisingly effective for its time. For decades, it worked. Over 20 ships carrying the plague arrived between 1650 and 1720, and Marseille's rules kept the disease mostly under control. Then came May 25th, 1720, the day the Grand Saint-Antoine sailed back into port after a year-long voyage. It had stopped at several ports along the way, and a number of sailors had already died. It was obvious to anyone paying attention that the ship was carrying the plague, so it was quarantined. But somewhere down the line, something went very wrong. By June 14th, the passengers were released, even though a few more people who had been on board had died during the quarantine. The deaths were weird, sudden, and unexplained, but they didn't show the usual signs of plague, so the ship was unloaded, and people went about their business. By July 20th, the first victim in Marseille had died from the plague. Within a few days, 4 more people were dead, and one of them had buboes, which everyone recognized as a sign of the plague. Since only one of the victims showed the usual symptoms, nobody really panicked yet. Life continued as if nothing was wrong, but the disease was already spreading quickly through the city. By the end of July, the outbreak was completely out of control. Hospitals were overflowing. Bodies were being dumped into mass graves, and people who thought they were still healthy fled the city, unknowingly carrying the plague with them. Eventually, the government decided it was time to step up. Marseille itself was placed under quarantine, which meant nobody could enter or leave the city. Violators were threatened with execution, and a massive plague wall was built outside to keep people from escaping. All of that might have worked if it wasn't for the fact that people had already scattered, carrying the plague wherever they went. The Great Plague of Marseille lasted from 1720 to 1722. Out of 90,000 residents, over 40,000 died. It was horrific, but it turned out to be the last major outbreak in Western Europe. Mass graves of Nuremberg. When the plague hit Nuremberg in the 1600s, the city was already a mess. The 30 Years' War had pushed crowds of refugees inside its walls, and the place couldn't handle them. The streets were packed, food was short, and when the plague arrived, it didn't take long before people started dying faster than they could be buried. By 1633, around 15,000 residents were gone. Centuries later, archaeologists found what was left of that disaster. On the outskirts of Nuremberg, they uncovered 8 massive burial pits filled with the remains of more than 1,000 men, women, and children buried together with no care for rank or ritual. The graves said a lot about how desperate things had become. The pits were crammed full, with bodies tilted sideways or sitting upright, and extra rows laid over them wherever space allowed. In medieval Christian tradition, people were usually laid to rest with their heads to the west and feet to the east, facing the rising sun. But in these pits, direction didn't matter anymore. The gravediggers were exhausted, the ground was frozen, and more bodies kept coming. Once a pit looked full, a thin layer of soil was tossed over it before another set of corpses went in. Radiocarbon dating placed the bones between the late 1500s and early 1600s, right in the middle of one of the city's deadliest outbreaks. Many of the skeletons had a faint green tint, probably from copper waste that had leaked into the soil from a nearby mill. Beyond that, plague victims looked no different from anyone else, which is why scientists still have to test the remains for traces of Yersinia pestis to be sure what killed them. The Black Death was one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. It wiped out tens of millions of people and overwhelmed entire societies in just a few years. Safe to say it changed the course of history. Now, some people like to think that if something like that hit today, we'd handle it better. But if COVID showed us anything, it's that we're about 2 bad headlines away from panic buying, lockdown protests, and people blaming phone towers for a global pandemic. It's not exactly a reassuring track record. That's all for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.